Hey, what's happening? Welcome back. Another episode for you right here, right now. And I've been spending the past few days doing these little thought video experiments where I just kind of want to share what's going on in my head. And of course, I do this every week, but I kind of just as an exercise in, I wouldn't say discipline, but just to put my thoughts out there and kind of get some sense of structure. Which absolutely doesn't happen. I just end up spilling words out of my face. But if you're interested to listen to what I'm talking about, you can head over to my YouTube channel for the podcast SoapyRao show and just check out what I'm putting out there. It might not appeal to you. But I was thinking while I was putting these things out, there's this sense of luxury and privilege that is being bandied about, right? A lot of people are talking about how certain people are privileged and how that should be acknowledged, and some people should apologize for the privilege, some people should be thankful. And I agree that you should be appreciative of it. Like, it's not in your control if you want to believe in destiny, or you believe in fate, or you believe in the idea that you are born and you have no control over that. It's whatever you buy into and whatever you believe in. It's not for me to impose or to deny any particular way a person thinks. But anyway, if you kind of just take this thing on a personal level and you look at the privilege that you might have without people yelling at you saying, how dare you speak like that? It's coming from a place of privilege, male privilege, white privilege, brown privilege, class privilege. Okay, I'm not even going down that path, and I'm not going to enter that debate. But I have something else to talk about, which happens to be around luxury and what we count as luxury, because it's usually associated with material position and material wealth, and how much you've kind of amassed in your life, right? Whether it's your stock portfolio, whether it's your savings, your investments, whether it's the house you live in or the houses you own, the amount of spending power, the number of cars you have, the school you send your kids to, or the clothes you wear, or the mode of transport, whatever it may be. These are things that are given a certain sense of importance and certain value when it comes to measuring your luxury status or your ability to afford certain kinds of luxury. But I was thinking there are certain kinds of luxury which we aren't willing to look at or rather acknowledge, and that makes it much more important to do, because the thing is that we take it for granted and we kind of ignore it at the cost of hoarding these other forms of luxury to show to other people. And of course, there's nothing wrong in having luxurious things in your life, because it's great to enjoy certain things that your hard work has allowed you to buy or to spend on. But if we keep running after these things without acknowledging the actual luxury we have, sometimes we kind of forget how important it is that the things that we take for granted can easily go away. But also at the same time, you have this thing where you pursue these other kinds of luxury without acknowledging that you don't have the essential luxury. And I'm coming to that, which is time. The time to kind of spend on what you want to do. Because when you are running behind making a certain amount of money, whether it's through a job, whether it's through a startup, whether it's through whatever form of money making process you've chosen for yourself, you kind of forget that the time which is yours is not yours anymore, and you're kind of spending it at the office. You're commuting for meetings, or you're going traveling on all these business trips, or you're traveling on all these various commitments, which your time is no longer in your control. You've kind of given it over to someone else for the exchange of money, or for the exchange of promises of money, for the eventual hope of that money translating to a luxury tag that you can accumulate. What happens is then you forget that these things are essentially what you have, and that's your time, with whom or with what you want to do. It's whom you want to spend it with what you want to spend it on. And I feel if the first luxury, that is time and the ability to spend time on what you want to do at your own pace, then the second luxury makes no sense, because then you're kind of, I wouldn't say living on borrowed time, but you're spending all your efforts on kind of hoarding all these luxury tags without having the essential opportunity or the essential luxury of being able to use it. And you see that in a lot of people, a lot of places. People save up and they have a lot of stress when it comes to doing these things because there's a certain number in mind, there's a certain goal in mind, and there's always this notion of I'll put it off until I get this particular goal, or I'll get to this particular number, and then I'll do things for myself, and then I'll do things in my own time, I'll do it at my own pace. But many a time you see it just doesn't happen, because you either pop it or you kind of just have a meltdown, and then it just seems like everything is futile and pointless. So yeah, I really think the past few months and even the past few, I think a couple of years, I've had this luxury of being able to choose what I do when I do, and I really think it's something that I never acknowledged, and I really, really value how important it is and how much it's done for me when it comes to being thankful for what I have. And I'm really, really amazed. But there is a but. I feel sometimes, though, this luxury of time does give you questions, because if you don't have time and you're distracted, or rather if you're not privileged enough, or you don't have this thing in your grasp, then you're just distracted all the time, just trying to make ends meet. Because that's the other end, right? One way is to kind of pursue these numbers, pursue these goals for this increased status, for more money. But then there are other people who don't have the luxury or the privilege of even kind of thinking ahead in the future to kind of have goals. They're just trying to make ends meet. What they make in that day just serves for feeding their family that day, or not even that. And in that case, you can't tell them like, oh, you can't run after luxury. Why would you want a bigger house? But that's fucking arrogant, and that's kind of selfish, saying, I can afford to dream like that, but you shouldn't. But I think in some ways, if you don't have time to think, and if you're not using that time well, then the mind goes down different paths, right? Because sometimes when you think about aging and planning for the future, and you have these thoughts of, when I get old, what will I do? Then the mind kind of takes you down this kind of slippery slope, when that you start stressing about something, and that's when time isn't your friend. It basically becomes this curse, which kind of just builds this cycling sense of doom and dread, and these ideas that keep kind of spiraling out of control and sending you into this not a very happy place, let's be honest, where you're kind of constantly stressing and not enjoying what you have now. So both things, of when you're constantly chasing the luxury tags without understanding that you need the time to enjoy these things, or you need to understand why you're doing these things, or you choose what to spend it on, is one problem. The other biggest problem is not having the option of even saying, you know what, I would like to have time, because it'd be nice to take a nap, or it'd be nice at all levels to kind of have extra food on the table, to kind of just take a break from work. That's a problem as well, when you don't have options. And the other problem is when you do have the time, but you kind of choose to spend it on these bad, I wouldn't say bad and right and wrong kind of things, but on these kind of pointless ways of sending the mind into this loop of thinking, which really doesn't serve any purpose, because we all are going to die. We are going to kind of get older. We're all going to wither away, but maybe hopefully in a dignified way, and we're not like stuck onto a machine. That's not in our control. But what is in our control is what we can do now with our mind, what we can do with our time, what we choose to do, and kind of enjoy the thing we have. Because, this will be like, when I'm 80, I'll do. There's no point. You don't know what's going to happen when you're even fucking 2 weeks from now. So I think this whole exercise, or this whole opportunity of me trying to just acknowledge what I have with time and what I've been doing, sometimes I do go down that path, and I think of, oh shit, when I'm this age, this is going to be what's happening. My daughter's going to be this old. Will I have the opportunity, will have the resources to take care of her? And I try kind of nipping that in the bud, because I'm literally sitting right here, right now, and I kind of want to be here right now, yeah. And enjoy and appreciate, and try to kind of just be, I wouldn't say in the moment, but kind of do what I've chosen to do, and enjoy that, and enjoy the people I'm with, because you never know. Yeah. Anyway, so I'll share that with you. Let me get to today's guests. Brendan Egan is an associate professor of sports and exercise physiology at Dublin City University, at the School of, let me get this right, Health and Human Performance. Yeah, I got it right. Today's episode, we speak about, so many things surrounding fitness, myths around fitness, what is good for you when it comes to an exercise format, when it comes to choosing what you need to do for your body type, considering your family history, considering what food you have available, what your body is used to, your metabolic thresholds, and also we talk about aging and skeletal muscles and how exercise and nutrition can affect that, how there are certain trends that are being promoted online to do certain things which other people tell you to do when it comes to peak performance, and adopting exercise routines that are being used by professional athletes, and how that need not necessarily be good for you because you aren't an athlete, a professional athlete in that field, but you might just be an IT engineer or a lawyer, and you kind of have to understand what your body needs and what you need at this point in your time, and what your goals, if you have goals, for your exercise plan, right? Why are you doing that? Are you doing it because you're applying it to a certain field? Are you applying it to a certain profession? Or are you just doing it to maintain your body health and your mental health and your physiology and your skeletal muscle strength? So there's so many things that Brendan educated me on, and there's so many things that he clarified. And I'm sure if you're someone looking at applying a lot of the knowledge out there, the information that you listen to or the information that you read, to your lifestyle, to the choices you make with what you eat and what you choose to do for exercise and how you spend your time, I think this episode will really give you a lot of clarity. I think it'll give you a sense of how do you make peace with what you choose to do, and how to not get torn apart in multiple directions by all the various things being thrown at you from different angles. So I enjoy talking to Brendan. I'm sure you'll enjoy listening to him as well. And Brendan, if you're listening, I thank you very much for joining me, and to all of you listening, appreciate it. Take care of yourselves. Till next episode, goodbye. God bless. Cheers. Brendan Egan, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
My pleasure to be here, Sandeep.
Lovely. So you're someone who's, a great person to answer questions that, in today's day and age, everyone sort of seems to be keyed in with health and wearing these CGMs and trying to biohack and doing all these things and understanding their body. But maybe can we just start from the basics, right? How much more as a society or as a group of people do we know about exercise and its relationship to lifestyle, quality of life, health, etc.?
Yeah, well, those new advances, I suppose, in technology are they're kind of like the icing on the cake from the point of view of what we know about exercise, in the sense that it's got to be at least 50 years since we first began to realize the benefits of exercise for health. And so ever since then, there's kind of been hundreds, thousands perhaps of studies that have identified the relationship between performing exercise on a regular basis and its relationship to improvement in health. Early on, quite a bit of the work was around aerobic exercise. In fact, it was much around the physical activity of work. Some of the early studies focused on bus conductors and the fact that when the bus conductors working in London who went up and down the stairs all day checking tickets, they were quite a bit healthier than the bus drivers who sat all day. And that was one of the early studies that showed the benefits of exercise. So throughout the years that followed that, much of the focus was on aerobic fitness and cardiovascular health. And then I would say in the last, say, 20 years, there's been this increasing appreciation for the benefits of strength training. And so where we are at the moment, I would say, is that, and particularly strength training as it relates to older age and the mitigating the loss of muscle mass and function that comes with age. And I would say where we are at the moment is that we've very well defined exercise guidelines in terms of what people should ideally get per week. And that generally falls out at something like 150 minutes per week of moderate intensity exercise, perhaps 75 minutes if you're doing sort of vigorous intensity exercise, and at least two strength promoting sessions of exercise per week. And there's a little bit more about flexibility and balance and so on that can come into that, but that's the broad prescription. And I think that people become maybe a little bit fixated on the fact that we must meet those guidelines, as opposed to many people simply don't do any exercise and we just need to get them moving towards the guidelines as opposed to actually achieving the guidelines. And I think maybe one of the messages that you and I will talk about is that something is better than nothing. And the big challenge, I think, for a lot of people is just to start doing something as opposed to trying to hit these aspirational guidelines. So to sum it all up in terms of the health benefits benefits of exercise are widely known, and they have been known for many years. And some of this new monitoring technology is helpful from the point of view of understanding the quantity of exercise that people are doing, but it can also actually be useful as in a form of accountability, so that people have targets they want to hit, or they have metrics that they might understand, push them along, and so on. So it's it's an interesting time with the new developments.
Because, the thing is, it seems like there's a lot of noise in the space of exercise, right? And I don't mean it in a necessarily bad or good way, but it just seems there's a lot more talk about it, or maybe this just the sort of the spaces where I visit, where I hear a lot more about it. So you mentioned an interesting thing, which is where people's lifestyles, when I look at even my parents' generation, it wasn't as sedentary, it was a lot more get up early, go to work. The thing was, exercise was more of a sport. You'd either play, badminton in the mornings, or you'd go for a walk, or you'd go for a round of golf, or you'd do something, but it was not necessarily categorized as exercise. But I see the same generation now. My parents are in their 60s and 70s, and I see them focusing a lot more. Besides going for their golf or going for whatever sport, they do exercise 4 to 5 times a week, and they do, as you mentioned, strength training to help the bone density and the muscle strength, right? But when we look at a younger population, it seems that everyone's, aspiration is to go after these crazy workouts like the Insanities and the P90X and these things. So I don't know if it's specific workouts or specific trends, especially with social media and these physical health influencers, promoting all these 15 minutes lose body fat, or in 30 days get all these challenges to get fit. I think it's great that exercise has become mainstream conversation, but something that interests and also concerns me is there a certain exercise that suits everyone, or how does someone find something that works for them? Because someone, say, from like the subcontinent like me, doesn't have the same the skeletal framework, doesn't have the same muscle tone, doesn't even have the same cardiovascular system as someone from, say, Europe. So if I go do something really intense, like I listen to Andrew Huberman, and I say, I'm going to do a cold plunge, then I'm going to do a 90-minute, exercise, which is really heavy and intense. It might feel good once or twice, but I don't know, is the wear and tear a lot more on the body for someone, or how does that kind of matching the exercise to the person or to the population work out?
Yeah, so you've touched on a lot of themes there, so I'm going to try and circle back and catch them all. So the first point you make, which is that in general, historically, physical activity was kind of was built into our workday, so there's a lot of talk about physical activity transitions, and that's the idea where we've gone from a society that relied very heavily on activities that involved manual labor and movement and so on, to a society that's more sedentary in our daily habits. So we've probably moved from that idea where physical activity is part of our day, to what is now more structured exercise. And there's an important distinction there, because in scientific terms, they are different. Physical activity is kind of any movement that you do that raises your heart rate above resting. Exercise then is structured physical activity with the goal of improving some component of fitness. So they're quite different if you think about it from a philosophical point of view. And it kind of then speaks to your point about the likes of the new trends on social media, or in different types of fitness themes that are emerging, where people are focused on very, very specific types of training to bring about somewhat specific goals. Sometimes it's around weight loss, sometimes it's around muscle growth, sometimes it's both. But they can be very, very different types of exercise under the broad terms of aerobic exercise, strength training, circuit training, all of these types of training. So to your question about whether there are better exercises for better people, you did mention two terms I'll come back to. Biohacking. And certainly there seems to be this, under that umbrella, I would place this idea of pursuing very extreme types of exercise as a means to achieve your goals. And the problem I see with that, and I think you were hinting at it, is that for someone who doesn't perform any exercise at all, and going back to my earlier point about beginning to do something at all, sometimes what people who do no exercise at all might need to do is just to begin to walk for 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week. They don't need to be going into high intensity body weight exercise followed by a cold plunge followed by a sauna. It's kind of the people who are in that domain. They're people who are very experienced, I would say, with exercise already, have tried lots of different types of training, and now they're gravitating towards novel trends and so on. So there's that element that the message needs to be, on social media, where you're seeing people pursue many of these, I would say, extreme types of exercise and activities. That's not really for everyone.
Mm.
It's probably somewhere around 60 to 80% of the population on average across lots of different countries don't engage in any form of exercise. So
Wow.
really, they're the people that we probably want to target. They're the people we want to target in terms of getting them to be more active.
That's a huge number,
And
60
then,
to
so your
80%.
other,
Yeah.
yeah, oh no, it's very high, yeah. So then your other point about the right exercise for the right person. You mentioned a very important phrase, which is what works for them, and that's a message that we use a lot, which is that for many people starting out on their exercise journey, if they've never done much before, it is about finding the exercise that works best for them. And you mentioned a few different things like golf or badminton. Sports can be very useful because they involve other people, and there can be that accountability, there can be the buddy system and all the social enjoyment that comes with that.
Hmm.
And from the point of view of just getting the body moving and becoming more aerobically, and perhaps a little bit on the strength side, becoming more fit in that way, those sports serve a great purpose. I suppose where we get into the more specific side of things is if, for example, you're dealing with someone who's 65 years of age, they're beginning to notice declines in their strength and their movement capabilities, and you want to intervene then with a very specific type of exercise training to improve strength, or to increase muscle size if someone has had a period of inactivity and they've lost a lot of muscle size. So there is that kind of balance to be struck between just having people involved in exercise in general because it's good for their health, versus very specific types of exercise to bring about some targeted change within their body. And again, the requirements in terms of expertise, in terms of support of physiotherapists or exercise scientists or fitness instructors, that does vary quite a bit depending on the person and the types of goals that they're after.
Mm. And it's nice to hear what exercise does. I mean, the importance of exercise is clearly marked in
Mm.
studies, and various fields of study have highlighted how important it is physically and even mentally and cognitively, psychologically, what it does for your mood, etc. But maybe what does a sedentary lifestyle do to your body? Because someone in their 20s might not feel it right now, right? Because the body's resilient. They don't, the aches and pains, you don't
Yeah.
think so. It's much easier to wake up in the morning and say, instead of even 5 minutes or 20 minutes on the cross trainer or treadmill, or even thinking, you know what, I'm young, I can handle it. I'm just going to have like a nice big piece of toast with Nutella on it, and it's much, much better, right? Because you got to be honest, sometimes waking up and getting that kind of that inertia to go out is a little hard. So you rather just
Yeah.
have, especially
Yeah.
if you're in a cold country, a hot cup of coffee, that's nothing like it. But
Yeah.
when you're in your 40s, then you start feeling a little bit of stiffness, and things take longer to recover. But what happens inside the body, like on a muscular level,
Yeah.
to your entire system when there's inactivity? I mean, it could be sitting on the sofa watching Netflix, could be sitting at a desk 10 hours a day, and maybe from a younger age, if you start this lifestyle versus someone who's active, what happens in the two scenarios?
Yeah, there are two great ways to think about this. So let's start with the physical inactivity piece. So one of the kind of axioms that we use nowadays is something like physical inactivity contributes to the increased risk of at least 35 different clinical conditions. So it's a really nice review. It's probably 15 years old at this stage, where there's this really nice picture of a human body. And
Mm-hmm.
what you see is lines coming out of pretty much every organ system and every part of the body that describe clinical conditions that are linked to physical inactivity.
Wow.
So
Okay.
there's one of the perils of my office is the rubbish bins just went by. But
Oh, that's fine.
so in the case of so like I'm saying, there's a huge number of clinical conditions where physical inactivity is seen to increase the risk.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is slightly different to the idea that exercise can mitigate the risk, and so that will bring me to the other point that you mentioned about getting old and the effects that would have. But if we stick on the physical inactivity piece for a second, you ask what happens within the body, and let's use the muscular system as an example. So as we obviously, as we grow up and we mature in adolescence, there's a certain amount of what we could call functional capacity that we develop. And functional capacity can be things like the ability to climb stairs or to get up and down out of a chair. And if we take that, kind of extend that out further, so getting able to get up and down out of a chair could be one form of movement or functional capability. And to extend that to kind of elite performance, it would be the ability to put weight on your shoulders and do a squatting exercise, which is, a very similar movement. So you might find that someone might, someone in there, let's say in their 20s, if they do no activity whatsoever, maybe they can get up and down out of a chair 10 times without stopping, but then they feel fatigued. Whereas you could, for an athlete, for example, you could put a weight of twice their body weight on their shoulders and they could do multiple repetitions of that exercise.
Mm-hmm.
So you see, for two people of the same age, you can see this massive range in terms of functional ability.
Mm.
Now, the reason that's important is because if we then think about how we progress throughout our age, from when people reach their peak, which again, for in something like strength or in aerobic fitness is probably somewhere in the mid-30s. From then on, it's fairly well established that there are, step slow declines that occur. Maybe it's 1% every other year, or maybe it's 1% per year that occur as we age. And at some point, physical fitness, whether we're talking about cardiovascular fitness or whether we're talking about strength, that will decline below a certain threshold that is often referred to as the disability threshold. Mm-hmm. And what that really means is that if your level of strength, for example, dips below a threshold where you're no longer able to get up and down out of a chair, then you're effectively in under the disability threshold, meaning you need the help of a carer, or you need an assistance with walking, or you may use a frame or a wheelchair. And as you say, when people are young and they're, in their 20s, they're not really thinking of this as something as a long-term consequence. But what the models show very nicely is that the greater that capacity that you build early in life, the less likely you are to drop below that disability threshold later in life. So it's almost like you think you build up your ceiling, or you build up your capacity to higher than here. And then when the declines begin to occur, even if they go in parallel, the person who's stronger or fitter early in life is much more likely to stay above that disability threshold later in life. And I suppose the other thing that's related to that is, someone who's involved in exercise training and developing strength or developing fitness, they're more likely to have lots of other good lifestyle habits, diet and sleep and all these other things that we talk about. So I kind of like to say to people, that difference, when we reach our peak, the difference in that peak between two individuals could be, enormous. And then as that is progressed throughout later life, you're seeing very, very different qualities of life, length of life, and so on as people age. And I think that's the thing maybe to bear in mind, is that you've got physical inactivity. There's no doubt that's a threat, but then there's also all these other benefits of activity in terms of the way that it can enhance the quality of our life later in life.
Yeah, because the thing is, if you see, at least if I think back to school and just I don't know, this is not scientific, but just the kids and the friends and the classmates who were more physically engaged in sport, or they seemed a lot more. I think even the attitude was a lot more better,
Yeah.
It was a lot more lively, if that's even not a scientific word, but it just seemed that way. But yeah, and in the 90s, we didn't really, when I used to, take part in track and field, I never really had a trainer. I never went to the gym. I remember the day before running a 400 meter, I got out of the house in jeans and ran, and that was my warm up. Yeah. And that's all I would do. But it feels, obviously with more information comes a lot more, informed choices, which is great. But I think a couple of things I want to understand is, one is how important is it to find something which you can do over the course of time? Because, sometimes again, coming back to those trends, you do 6 months of CrossFit, the next thing you get an injury because it's not really worked out for you. It's too intense. And then you go really, you're like, oh, that didn't work for me. I'm going to go into jiu-jitsu or do some, and every 6 months you stop because you're injured. Then you get back into another form of exercise or martial art or sport. But is it okay to do that, or rather just do something which you can not push to 100%, but you're doing to 60, 70%, but you're doing it for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. You're doing it from your 20s to your 60s, your 80s, but you're not getting that significant heart rate going up. You're not getting that significant burst of muscle energy of pushing that in the gym. You see. Yeah, I just want to understand how important is it to keep a sustained exercise sort of program rather than changing it up every 3 months?
Yes, that's a good question. And to answer that, I have to kind of delve into the way that some of these lines of evidence come from within the scientific domain. So, a lot of the studies where we look at, say, the benefits of exercise or the benefits of aerobic fitness, and we're looking at long-term effects in terms of cardiovascular health, mortality, and so on, they're done in designs where people are answering questionnaires, or perhaps they're having one fitness test and they're then being followed for many years of follow-up. And in those types of studies, we don't often get a good picture of the intensity that people are working at, or the exact type of exercise that they're doing. It can be hard to get down to the granular detail there. So the other so they're observational studies. And the other way we kind of look at this is where we do so-called intervention studies. And this is where someone will undertake a period of training for 12 weeks or 24 weeks or a year, and different outcomes will be measured from that fitness intervention. And based on the outcomes over that period of time, we then kind of infer the benefits that might be had later in life based on what we see in these other cohorts. So we're kind of merging different lines of evidence when we come up with these recommendations. The reason I say all that is it can become quite difficult to answer very specific questions like you asked there. So could I point to a research study that says, that it's okay to work out for 6 months and then take a break for 6 months and so on? It's very difficult to do those types of studies, but what we can kind of get at is patterns. Like a lot of the studies would say that cardiovascular fitness, for example, is protective as in later life. And so the question might become, what does it take to develop a good cardiovascular fitness? And there's a certain type of intensity of training that's needed there. But another question is, what level of activity does it take to maintain cardiovascular fitness as we age? And in that case, the answer actually it doesn't take a huge amount. It's more that you stay active continually as opposed to becoming inactive. And that's how I would kind of answer the question that you've asked there, is that, do we need people to be doing extreme forms of exercise for 6 months, getting injured, and then maybe not returning to exercise for 6 months or 9 months? To me, that's not a good pattern. I would much rather see people who are engaged in, fun activities that they enjoy, that make them sweat and make them breathe heavy in a way that lots of different forms of exercise do, and that it's enjoyable and they continue to do it throughout their life. So, my own perspective, I've been fortunate from that point of view, and maybe it's a little bit of the bias that I bring, is that I've been involved in team sport for my whole life. So I play a sport called Gaelic football, which is it's similar to soccer, except we use our hands. So it's, for your audience, if they know Australian rules football, it's very similar.
Right.
That. But by being involved in team sport all the time, we're engaged in sprinting activities, we're engaged in moderate intensity activities, we do weight training as part of that, and then all of that is done in a collective group, and it's usually done by someone else doing the training. So I'm sort of fortunate that my activity in my life is all pretty much with other people, designed by someone else. It's all very easy for me to just turn up and train. It's a very, very different thing to try and, for someone who is maybe trying to motivate themselves to do their own training, who's going to a gym by themselves and trying to hit these exercise guidelines. So I appreciate there's an enormous continuum in terms of what types of activities people enjoy, what they're likely to stick to, and what benefits they're likely to derive. But the bigger picture thing is, I think, that to say is that generally we want to be active, I wouldn't say as much as possible, but throughout our life course, in as much as that allows, without having to be overly dramatic in terms of following very intense exercise regimes or pushing ourselves too hard to the extent where we pick up injuries and aren't able to exercise. It's finding, and I know it's boring to say this, but it's finding moderation, I suppose, in the context of all of the different types of exercise opportunities that are out there.
Yeah, the reason I asked you, we went down that path, is because I remember in 2008, I was in my 20s, I had this guy coming, he was a trainer, and he would pushed me quite a lot. You remember the movie 300 when it came out? There was a trainer called Jim Jones. So Jim Jones had developed this program for the actors in 300, and that's basically doing 300 reps in 5 sets. So these exercises from like deadlift to push-ups to, and then he would say, okay, let's vary it up. Let's go to the garden and throw rocks. And a couple of times in the workout, I've thrown up, like I felt really nauseous, and but he would push me, and and then I would just go sit in an office job, and I'm going, okay, just type. I don't need these forearms to type an email, But now, and then every night before class, I would send a text saying, not feeling well. I made excuses not to work out. But now I've been, I've had this person coming in, helping me with the yoga practice for the past 3 years. And I look forward to the exercise. I look forward to the stretching. I look forward to the sustained holds, which also give some burn. They're not obviously like doing deadlifts with, 100 kilos or whatever it may be. But maybe is there a correlation, or is there an advantage to enjoying the exercise you're doing?
Well, I think that's a really important point, because if you enjoy it, you're more likely to do it. So, in your description there, I think you highlighted a challenge that many people feel, which is that when they engage initially in an exercise training program, particularly if it's intense, it can be enjoyable initially and they embrace the challenge. But if it becomes, if they become fatigued or become sore, or they wonder why they're doing it, and it's not as enjoyable as doing other activities, then they are less likely to engage. And I think enjoyment is the major piece if we're thinking about long-term adherence or long-term compliance. Just as you were describing the 300 there, the workouts, it reminded me of an important point that I should have mentioned earlier, which is that a lot of times the type of exercise and the target or the goal, they're very tightly linked. So if someone really wants to produce, for example, large amount of weight loss through exercise, obviously combined with diet, generally speaking, they will target these kind of high intensity efforts. There's been this idea that high intensity training combined with appropriate diet is the best way to burn fat. And, there is a certain, again, truth to that, assuming that someone can stick to the exercise regimens. On the other hand, if you want to build muscle, for example, the most important determinant of building muscle mass is the volume of training. So there has to be a certain amount of training done in order to build muscle, and that can actually be quite a high volume for some people. And so it might require 3 or 4 or 5 sessions per week of strength training. Now, in saying all that, pretty much what I'm saying there is optimal. I'm describing the optimal conditions to get rid of body fat, or I'm trying optimal conditions to build muscle. And not everyone needs optimal. For a lot of people, it's just some form of progress above baseline. That will be good enough to provide health benefits. And that kind of goes back to my point that I was making at the start, which is that something is better than nothing. If you look again at these epidemiological or observational studies, and they kind of try and show a dose response in terms of, hours of exercise per week relative to health benefits. And again, pretty much without fail, the most benefit is derived from, say, the first hour worth of exercise per week. It's not, take the example of this, someone who does 0 activity and now they do 1 hour per week. That's going to derive a much greater health benefit than someone who's already doing 5 hours a week and now they're doing 6 hours per week. So that initial commencement of a new exercise regimen, that's going to drive the most amount of benefit. So pushing on and on and on towards larger number of hours, larger number of sessions, pushing for this idea of optimal. That, again, is important for a small percentage of the population. Athletes, for example, high achievers, people who compete in functional fitness and CrossFit and similar things. That's where optimal really matters. For the vast majority of the population, it is just more getting active and, doing something that involves enough of that minutes of aerobic activity, minutes of strength training activity done per week. Again, heading towards those guidelines that I mentioned earlier.
One of the problems I have is I listen to a lot of audiobooks with like the Navy SEALs, the SAS, and a lot of their training regimens. And then when I'm exercising, I'm like, man, I can't even do. But then in my head, I'm like, that's their life. Like when you look at an elite athlete or an elite soldier, their entire targeted exercise is for that, lethal engagement or that peak performance in that moment. And that's when muscle memory, the peak, as you said, optimal muscle thing. And also, like athletes, these guys have entire teams around them, from
Yeah.
trainers to sports scientists to nutritionists. So when someone trains like a David Beckham and doesn't play football but sits in an IT job, it does. Is there a point after which exercise is bad for you?
I wouldn't say it, I wouldn't frame it as being bad for you, but there's certainly, like many things, there's a law of diminishing returns, in the sense that kind of the example that I was giving there, if someone is hitting the exercise guidelines in terms of minutes per week of aerobic activity and strength training sessions per week, once they go above that to the extreme, there's probably not much extra benefit being derived there. And so I wouldn't say it's bad for you, but there's probably, not much value in that extra time invested. Now, saying that, you bring up the athletes. It's a great point, because what I often feel, again, having been around elite sport, both as a practitioner and as a player myself, is that athletes in general, like you say, they're motivated, they've got people around them and so on, but they do actually have, in my experience, a greater capacity to tolerate heavy training. And maybe that's why they've become the elite athletes that they are, because whatever their genetic or phenotypic background is, they're able to handle high training loads, and they're able to recover quicker than an average member of the population. And the likes of the Navy SEALs and so on, I mean, their whole pathway to becoming a Navy SEAL, it is a filtering process, starting off with a very wide intake of recruits, and then eventually going through multiple different types of training and selection till they eventually become Navy SEALs. I mean, similar to things like the NFL, for example, in the US, these are the elite of the elite, and they're kind of freakish in their ability to do athletic feats. Some of the things, if you watch something like the NFL and you look at the NFL Combine, some of the numbers that those athletes are hitting from the point of view of fitness testing, I mean, they're so far beyond what the average in the population would be. And I suppose that's again a message there, is that we shouldn't really compare ourselves to athletes in that regard, because for the reasons that you mentioned in terms of their support, their motivation, I'm saying their genetic background and so on, phenotype, they are the extreme, the 1%, or maybe the 0.1% of the population, and not all of us can train or respond to exercise training like that.
I'll remind myself that when I'm reading the next book about
Yeah.
But there's a thing now where people are doing these exercises, and you see them in the news and then this is like, these are anecdotal, I'm sure, but I don't know if you've come across this, where people certainly, you hear them like, yeah, I did 1 hour at 15 miles on the treadmill, and next thing you hear, the person's collapsed of a heart attack in the gym. So, I mean, this is not obviously everyone. I mean, this is, again, a small percentage. But that's why I asked you, is too much exercise bad? Because, post-COVID, it seemed like a lot more. It seems like a lot more people in their 30s and 40s are getting these massive cardiovascular, attacks, and sadly, many of it happens in the gym, and so it seems like a scary place to go.
Yeah.
So is there any correlation at all, or is this just a freak case and you're hearing more of it because people are able to communicate this more?
Yeah, I think you've touched on an important point there, is that these kind of funny enough, these freakish occurrences seem to become in the news now. And there's this old saying, I'm sure you've heard, if it bleeds, it leads. So if there's a bad story to do with health, it usually will make headlines.
Yeah.
But don't get me wrong, there are risks associated with exercise. I mean, they're extremely, extremely low in terms of the incidence per 1,000 is very, very low from the point of, say, sudden death during exercise. So, for example, if we're applying to do a research study, we often have to state in our ethics approval applications, there is a certain amount of risk of performing exercise at high intensities, but I mean, it's fractionally small compared to the benefits that are likely to be derived. So, I'm not surprised, for example, that you might hear of a death during exercise like that. That's just the way sometimes, like I said, the world reports things. You sometimes hear a story that's kind of emerged that has been spun up quite a bit as well at the moment, is this idea that people who engage in very, very high intensity or very prolonged activity can have certain changes that occur in the heart, for example,
Mm.
that could be pathological in the long run. So there's often these discussions of something like the cardiac arrhythmias or the irregular heartbeats that some athletes who engage in ultra endurance type activities get, or there's changes within the wall of the heart muscle that can occur, that is natural, I guess, as we perform exercise, but can become pathological in later life. So you hear a little bit about that, but again, if you look carefully at the literature, although it might be reported publicly and in the media as exercise, in inverted commas, what it actually looks like to someone who's in the scientific domain is that, it's a really extreme form of either exercise in terms of intensity or duration, and done for many, many years, as opposed to just one exercise bout or, a 6-week program or something like that. So the
Right.
devil is always in the detail with a lot of these headlines and concerns. And so it's like, there's a grain of truth there, but it's a very, very small risk relative to the benefits that people can derive from exercise.
Right. No, I think that's it's important to address, because you can't just put a blanket statement, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
it's so easy, as you said, someone sitting and having a bag of chips is like, see, exercise, I told you, it's bad, it's going to kill me. It's like not, but strange thing is, a few years back, I think 2021, I think my dad's friend was, I think in his 70s, he was doing yoga. And at the end of the yoga class, you do the dead body pose, which is Shavasana, right? You relax in that.
Mm.
And so happens he died in that, which is
Oh.
a great way to go. I mean, not that he went, but if you think about it, that's the ultimate relaxation, right? Just to say, it's not just the treadmill, it could be yoga as well. Just to
Yeah,
add that.
you're gonna make people afraid to get into that pose now if they're listening.
Yeah, sometimes, yeah, I'm in that. I'm like, is it today?
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah.
Another thing I've been listening to quite a lot over the past year or so is this whole conversation around longevity, right? And when you talk about longevity, there are obviously the common themes, which is exercise and these other things, as you said, which is to trigger these systems in the body to help the body live longer, like the cold plunges. You have the windows of fasting, the windows of starvation, basically adversity that helps the body wake up
Yeah.
these systems which are in place. I don't know the technical terms for them, but just
Hormesis is the way they describe it. Yeah.
Homeostasis, right? And autophagy is another one I heard, which is
Yeah.
the body repairing. So in the scheme of longevity, exercise, you spoke about how something which can be done over years, and in the elite athletes, they build up to the elite level. They don't start out elite, but obviously they have certain traits that do help them in that space. But you do focus in another space, which if you could talk about would be great, which is the whole inputs when it comes to nutrition. And in that, what we hear a lot about in exercise is protein intake. And I think you also focus on carbohydrate restriction. So could you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, so in relation to longevity and health span, it's quite tricky because some of the best models and the best ideas are coming from rodent models, and the idea of translating those then into humans, things like autophagy, like you mentioned, they're difficult concepts to then demonstrate in humans. So we often get a lot of our hypotheses from things that are observed in rodents, and then we try and almost retrofit them to what's happening in humans. On the other hand, you look at something like the longest lived humans, so studies of centenarians, for example. Oftentimes the strongest predictor of their longevity is their genes. And unfortunately we can't choose our parents, but we've got the genes we've got, and there's a very strong component of long life that is linked to our genes. So again, you've probably heard of the blue zones, and many of the descriptors within there, the common features are they don't actually talk. No, the people in the blue zones are not doing strength training in a gym. This is one of the paradoxes that often gets put to me, is that how you talk about strength training and you talk about protein, but if we look at the blue zones, for example, there's no evidence that in those cohorts that's the type of activities that they're undertaking. Although I do often counter by saying, but diet is an important component, as is being physically active, whether it's pure strength training or not. So I guess what I'm saying in the midst of all of that is, again, what we're doing with sort of exercise interventions and dietary interventions in older adults is that we're taking a concept that it will be better to be stronger and have a decent level of muscle mass on the body, for as long as possible. Again, thinking of that disability threshold and thinking of quality of life, they're the types of interventions we can do in older adults. And yes, okay, centenarians and the blue zones and so on, they seem to have these other components, but that's their specific cohorts. If we're talking generally about how we might try and improve health span and functional ability in later life, it does seem to be around these habits of maintenance of good exercise, strength training in particular, and as we'll probably get on to talk now about the dietary components around protein. So that's, I guess, an opening comment to make there. And your question then about protein in particular. The paradigm really here is that when we are undertaking exercise training and we're trying to augment the response to exercise training, the macronutrient that seems to have the most benefit in that regard is protein. Now, it may be that there are people who already consume enough protein, in which case they don't need to have additional protein to get their benefits. But there may be people who are getting inadequate levels of protein, and therefore additional protein or higher protein diet can benefit their response to training. But I think it's very hard to put a number on what's how much of the adaptation is exercise, how much of the adaptation is diet. But generally speaking, what I would say is that the vast majority of benefits are coming from the exercise itself, and then manipulations of the diet, or if we're talking about muscle strength here and muscle mass, the manipulation of diets is adding on another small percentage to that. The reason that protein has become the focus that it has is because, again, generally speaking, across most countries, when they've been surveyed from a dietary point of view, you've got your recommended daily allowance, which is relatively low. And I'll give you the numbers if it's of interest. So the RDA in most countries is 0.8 grams of protein per kg of body mass. So for someone who weighs, roughly my size, 80 kg, that's like 64 grams of protein. Now, per day. Now, with an athlete, for example, generally the recommendation is about 1.6 to 2 grams per kg body mass. So it's upwards towards 2 to 3 times the RDA. And then in the case of an older adult, the current guidelines are 1.2 grams per kg body mass per day, which again is about 50% more than the RDA. And there's been this, again, it's probably not the podcast to begin speaking about the RDA and where it came from and will it be revised and so on. But again, generally speaking, the thinking at the moment is that the protein intake that people should get on a daily basis is probably around the 1.2 gram per kg mass, body mass mark, rather than the 0.8. And again, whether it needs to go higher than that, that's debatable. In athletes, the reason it's so high is because we have much more exercise, much more protein turnover. We're trying to repair, recover, and so on. But certainly the general population, it probably needs to be a little bit higher than on average it is. And so that brings the question, are we eating enough protein later in life? And one of the reasons why we might not be is because as people age, particularly over 60, they begin to develop what's known as the anorexia of aging, which is where people's appetite actually becomes a little bit less as they get older. They get fuller easier. They get fuller on protein-containing foods a lot easier, to the extent that they may end up eating less protein than they had earlier in life. And then potentially you've got the effects there of not supporting training adequately, not having the building blocks for muscle. So I should have mentioned that already. One of the main reasons we're focused on protein in older life is because protein in the diet is the building block that we use then for the proteins in our muscles.
Right.
So I tried to wrap up a very kind of broad topic there in a few examples, but hopefully that gives you an illustration as to why we have become interested in this area of protein. But like I say, the exercise component is by far the biggest determinant of health benefits there, and the dietary manipulation is kind of, like I said, the icing on the cake.
Right. No, and that, I think, it really sort of is significant because, I'm speaking on behalf of people in India right now who, many of them are vegetarians, and many people are now sort of turning to whey protein and supplements, right? No, so what my question to you is, how bad is carbohydrates in whatever form, whether it's bread or whether it's rice, whether it's pasta? Because you hear more and more people when you talk about health, like cut out the carbs. But is there a certain threshold that a certain, like, I can take rice, you can take whatever the form of carb that is suiting you, or should we just completely cut out carbs as we get older?
Okay, that's a great question. So yeah, I've been involved obviously in work that has been around high protein diets, but I have also been in work on the other side, which is ketogenic diets, which is, ultra low carbohydrate diets. And the point I would make is that all of these are kind of tools within the toolbox of a practitioner. And, as an individual in the population who's consuming science and social media and so on, they're thinking about what diet should I follow.
Yeah.
It can be very, very difficult to decide what the best evidence and what the best person to follow and the best information and so on. So when we use ketogenic diets, for example, in athletes, generally what we're trying to do there is trying to either improve their ability to burn fat during exercise, or perhaps we're using it because it can often be a calorie restricted diet and they can drop body weight. But that is not really the same as saying it's the best way to drop body weight or it's the healthiest diet to consume, because ultimately, if you're, say, following a ketogenic diet and you're cutting out carbohydrate, you're introducing other foods to the diet and different types of fats, for example, different types of protein. So moving all of these different components of the diet at any one time makes it difficult to assess what the benefit or the drawback might be of any given diet. And a bit like the exercise science research that I was describing, where on some hand you've got these lines of evidence where it's people who've had their diet measured and followed for many, many years, the observational studies, versus the studies that follow people for 12 weeks or 24 weeks of a given diet. We're oftentimes trying to pull those things together and give health advice based on that. So my personal view is that there are times where it can be good to manipulate carbohydrate intake, up or down, depending on the goals of the individual. For athletes, for example, we can often use low carbohydrate diet, like I said, to bring about positive responses to training. But equally, we generally have high carbohydrate diet when we want them to be involved in high intensity activities. So to your question specifically about should we be cutting carbs, or is it the best, or people in India who eat a lot of carbs, is that a bad thing? We kind of use a hierarchy, often when thinking about this, which is that the first question tends to be like, is the person eating the appropriate amount of calories? If they're overeating on any type of calorie, it's going to be a problem. We published a study a couple of years ago where we fed people quite a high protein diet, ultimately in the absence of exercise. And a lot of people have this kind of thing in their head, well, as long as I'm not eating carbs, it's okay, I won't gain weight. But they overate on protein, which they overate is the the important word there, and they still manage to gain weight in the form of body fat. So, you start off this question about the number of calories, and then obviously you think about the diet quality and, the basic principles you'd have there of avoiding ultra processed foods and having, minimally processed foods or foods that are close to nature. I'm not saying anything that isn't out there in the public domain. Yeah. And then I suppose the question does become about, are certain scenarios, is it useful to restrict certain macronutrients? So, for example, in the case of diabetes now, say 15 years ago, there was still a lot of talk about low-fat diets for diabetes. In the last 10 years, 10 years, it's become a complete sea change. Now people are talking about low-carbohydrate diets as the first line of treatment when it comes to diabetes. Try not to go to medication, try and do a dietary manipulation first. And there's, again, a lot of evidence as to why a low-carbohydrate diet would be useful there. So I'm not trying to avoid your question, but more trying to give you the perspective that there's lots and lots of different contexts where certain dietary considerations need to come into play. And there are certainly clinical conditions, and I'm obviously aware of the explosion in obesity and diabetes currently in India. And in those scenarios, for example, that is where I mentioned about diabetes in the first line of defense being low carbohydrate diets. That certainly is an example of where, in some ways, I don't know if you'd say the carbohydrates are bad, but you're certainly saying that the advice at the moment would be to cut carbohydrate if you're trying to deal with someone who's developed diabetes. And again, as you know, diabetes just doesn't happen overnight. It's a continuum. And so again, people working with their healthcare practitioner will be able to better decide what the best diet for them would be.
Yeah, no, it's as you said, it's not a black and white situation because but what I'm intrigued by, like when I look at the development of that India is going through right now, and just if you look at a different population, because every country unfortunately does have a population that is low income that is
Mm.
struggling to get just food, let
Yeah.
alone thinking about nutrition, thinking about these things we're speaking about, which is exercise. And in India, that
Yeah.
percentage is quite a large number.
Yeah.
And even now, when you look at what's happening in the UK with rising prices of gas bills and the electricity, there are people struggling to make ends meet, right? So these things, I feel, in an Indian context, it's great that more people are aware of exercise, but there is a big population that is unable to do these things.
Yeah.
So how do we address this as a concern for a population that eventually will be unwell, will be sick because of their lifestyle, because of their situation, because of the lack of access to
Mm.
good food, nutritious food, and lack of the inability to exercise because they just have to do things, right? They might have to go
Yeah.
drive, be a taxi driver for
Yeah.
18 hours, being sedentary, and then develop issues with lower back or other muscular issues, or maybe even issues that will affect their organs because they're just being in this job which is not healthy for them. So
Yeah. Look,
are these things you address or you look at from a research point of view? Because it's clearly not the primary point in their mind, but
yeah.
there is there's a big sickness in that group.
Yeah, look, I think you're touching on a really important point again there, which is that, the number one, the best predictor often of health outcomes in later life is socioeconomic status. And
Mm.
sometimes, we are fortunate, um, people who are well above the poverty line or middle class and above, they have more than adequate income and time to be engaging in these types of activities. And I often, people will make judgments sometimes around, say, I'll talk about Ireland now in particular, there'll be things said about the obesity crisis and taxing of sugar and all of these kinds of things. And, on the face of it, they may make sense, but you only have to spend a bit of time with the populations that we're talking about here in terms of the working class and those who are struggling to make ends meet. We did some work a few years ago in a school in a disadvantaged area of Dublin, and some of the things some of the things I was mentioning there about being more active or eating minimally processed foods, in other words, fresh fruit and veg, for example. I mean, these were things that were completely alien to the students and the parents who were involved in the study because it just wasn't possible. They're living in areas where they don't have access. They're living on incomes where that type of thing would make no sense. For example,
Mm.
you tell them to buy fresh fruit and vegetables for their kids because that's, a healthy choice.
Yeah.
They would say, well, if I buy fresh fruit and veg and my kids don't eat it, then I've wasted my money and I don't have much money. And so, you get into when you really deal with the practicalities of this, so much of this kind of optimization of exercise, optimization of diet, it's for people who are well, we often refer to in the older generation call them the elderly. The people who most volunteer for our research studies are the people who are already well, and
Yeah.
they just they want more supervised exercise.
Yeah.
And it's an enormous challenge. I honestly I don't research that area closely enough to have good informed opinions of how it needs to be addressed.
Right.
But there are many issues there that are so far removed from the types of optimal kind of conditions that we're talking about. And what I often hear spoken about mostly is that like to lift people up out of poverty or to to improve the wealth inequality that's there. These are more government type policies rather than say practitioner or researcher led on the ground. And yeah, hopefully nothing that I've said today is insensitive to the idea that there's a huge proportion of the population where these optimal issues don't matter. It's the
Yeah.
more basic fundamental considerations that need to be addressed.
No, absolutely not at all. I wanted to address it because I'm curious, because I understand the place I'm sitting in right now that gives me the luxury to even talk about this,
Yeah,
right? Whether
yeah,
it's like, sometimes I've gone on an 18-hour fast or a 21-hour fast, and I'm like,
mm,
okay, now let me break the fast consciously, right?
yeah,
Let me started with some fiber, maybe started with some, some raw salad or maybe
yeah.
some thing, then get in the sugar, then get in the protein, then get in the fat.
Mm.
And it takes a lot of thinking and luxury.
Yeah.
That's a luxury when it comes to planning your meal, right? Or because then I look at someone and they have a 10-minute break between, they drove someone to work. Now they have to
Yeah.
get back, pick up the person. They just go have a quick pastry or something that's processed with sugar.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I can't judge them, right?
No, for sure.
And
Yeah, it's
that's,
very
yeah.
difficult.
Yeah, and that's such a curious thing because you feel like, there's a bit of an echo chamber. Like when I talk to some people, they're like, yeah, I exercise this morning, or I'm on a keto diet, or someone's like,
Yeah.
I'm on a paleo diet. And it's so easy to sort of get lost in that and not realize that while the smaller percentage of the population, which I'm fortunate to be a part of, is aware of this, whether it's autophagy or hormesis, that
Mm.
the gap is getting wider, where more
Yeah.
people are being sort of subject to these adverts by these big
Mm.
FMCG companies shoving down biscuits and cookies and you ready to eat meals out of a thing, and that's the population that these people are targeting, the ones who don't have choice. And clearly, like in America, juvenile diabetes, I'm sure even in the UK you have that issue,
Mm.
and in Ireland as well.
Mm.
But it seems like the gap is just growing wider, right, between people who can afford to make healthy choices and people who are subject to unhealthy products and a way of life even.
No, I think you've summed it up very nicely there. There's not much more I can add other than I'll give one example of the exercise side of things. So,
Mm.
it's all well and good talking about these exercise guidelines and referring to gym type programs. And, someone, the answer was, oh, well, certain people don't have access to a gym. And then the response is often, oh, but, you can exercise around your home and you can walk. And, well, actually, some people can't exercise around their home because they live in areas that are unsafe, or,
Yeah.
then they will exercise in your home. And well, the exercise in your home would involve buying equipment, for example, or it requires a home where there's enough space. And sometimes there are many, many people living in a home. So, there are so many considerations that would, in a certain subset of the population that push against, as you say, this kind of luxury that we have to choose when we exercise, have all kinds of selection of foods for our diets and so on. And it's a problem that's enormous and often doesn't get the airtime. So I'm glad you brought it up today.
Yeah, no, yeah, because it's so easy to project our views on someone,
Yeah.
and our situation, and like, oh yeah, as you said, you're like, why don't they, get some fresh air? Many
Yeah.
times the air around there
Yeah.
is not fresh,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
being in a dysfunctional home, low income home, it's not
Yeah.
a good situation. Many times it's abusive. There's a lot of things. So and I think maybe that's something to, people say exercise is good for your mind. You get you out of depression. But what if you're too steeped in that situation to even get out of that, right? I mean, I don't have a question for you in that, but it seems like there's so many various factors that
Yeah.
sometimes I can't even think of because I'm not in that situation, and it's not really fair on me to say, why don't those people exercise and they'll feel better.
Yeah, it's a very difficult cycle, the scenario where someone's getting very little activity, and we would say, well, even at the basic level, get out for a walk, but yet they
Mm.
live in a built-up environment where it's either not safe to walk, or there's not really the ability even to find a place where it's comfortable to walk, because there's too much construction or too many roads, or there's not appropriate footpaths, and these types are crime is high, so then that's a kind of a difficult, very difficult situation, because I don't think, again, there's much doubt about the idea that some form of activity, including going for just a half-hour walk, for example, several times a week, can be beneficial to cognitive function and mental health and so on. But there are some people who are unfortunately in a position where it's very, very difficult to do that. And yeah, like it's a very difficult cycle and a place to be.
You know, um, Before we sort of start winding down, you work closely with pro athletes, with elite athletes, and I think you're even working with the Irish football team, right?
Yeah,
Um,
correct.
so I want to understand. We've spoken about the average population of people, and you told us very wisely, we don't have to try to work out like Navy SEALs, and he told me, which I'm going to take to heart, which is good. But
Yeah.
we've spoken about longevity and how there are a few things which are good. And of course, not for everyone, but there are certain situations. But there's certain base things that you can do, which is exercise, strength training, with balancing your diet, etc., which are good for cognitive health and for physical health as we get older. But what I'm interested to know is, you work with these men and women who are such
Mm.
highly finely tuned machines in their own respect, whether it's in their sport or the preparation they do for that sport. Like, when you look at, when we watch TV, we watch like a Rafael Nadal, or you
Yeah.
look at a Federer, and then they retire, right? What happens to a body like that? I mean, because a lot of these guys are so highly
Mm,
engaged and mentally focused in that space for the span of their career. When they leave that sport, and you've been in that space, right, when
mm,
you're in your own sport,
mm.
um, what I don't know if it's related to health, but I'm just curious. What happens once you leave that? Because you've had that discipline for years, that push for years, that focus for years. Does it stay on? Is the need to continue to do that level of exercise still stay on, or what shifts in the person's mind and
Yep.
lifestyle?
Yeah, there's a few ways of thinking about this. So, most athletes, they love competition.
Mm,
And it's the competitive juices that kind of that are flowing that keep them going and motivated all that time. So when competition ends, my experience is that many of them don't engage in the same level of activity. It's hard to imagine, a cyclist who's putting in 30 hours a week, you're going to continue to do that when there's no competition for them to be involved in. And
mm,
similarly, guys, who are involved in team sports who are competing at a professional level, when they're no longer able to play at a professional level, it's not like they're going to train 5 or 6 times a week, with their friends in the park. So
mm,
the one of the major changes that will occur is the absence of competition will mean that they probably won't engage in as much activity. That doesn't mean they stop completely. Again, there are examples where people, completely stop training, but many of them, because they enjoy activity and they enjoy their sport, they'll continue to be involved in some domain, but are perhaps not at a competitive level and certainly not doing the same volume of training.
mm,
So already in that scenario, there will inevitably be declines in their performance and in their fitness as a result. And at the same time, they're probably still going to maintain a level of fitness above and beyond the average member of the population. There was a study done many years ago that looked at the longevity outcomes of people involved in the Tour de France, and generally, again, there were health benefits that were obvious, and whether that was to do with the activity when they were younger or whether it was the fact that they stayed more active during later life. It's hard to separate those effects, but generally speaking, people will stay active. But you might be getting at the idea that many of our athletes that we know that are in the public domain, when they retire, they begin to put on quite a bit of weight. And one of the things I think there is the decline in overall training volume. And I feel that sometimes maybe there's two things happening. One is that they were very disciplined with what they ate during their career because they had to be. Most
yeah,
athletes in most sports want to be slightly lighter or leaner, than
yeah,
they might be naturally. So they're generally exerting some kind of control around their diet, much of the time. So perhaps when they retire, they begin to become a bit more relaxed about their diet, but they also may continue to consume the same amount of food or close to it that they used to when they were competing. And yet now they're
mm,
training far less. And so I think
right.
it's a combination of a little less discipline and a little less training. And, the weight gain can come very quickly soon after that. But
Mm,
yeah, it's interesting. So that, they're the physical changes, but there's a whole body of work and research around the transition from being an athlete into retirement. And again, very interesting research around the way that elite level athletes have to deal with retirement and some of the emotions that they go through, and again, sometimes bouts of depression and so on, in terms of trying to deal with the now post retirement lifestyle. And so again, it's many multifactorial in terms of the considerations, but yeah, it's certainly a major concern for athletes as they approach their retirement as to what they're going to do next.
yeah, it's almost like losing a sense of purpose, right? Which can be really sort of leaves you in the dark, and you're
Oh
like,
yeah,
what do I
many
do
many
now?
athletes will use the phrase identity. So they'll talk about the fact that their identity was wrapped up in their achievements and their activities as an athlete. And when that ends, if they don't go into coaching, they're effectively now their identity can be they're now a retired and well known because they were popular in their sport. But again, like we were talking about, that's only a very small number of people who achieve the status that they're famous or well known, into retirement. Many other athletes at many levels are no longer athletes, and yeah, you're right, they lose that identity or that purpose, and unless they find something to replace that, again, there can be negative consequences.
Yeah, no, it's nice to get insight from someone who's so closely involved in the sport, right? Because you always otherwise get speculation like, oh, after he retired, he just lost his way. He went to the pub every day. But there's clearly so many nuances, right? Because you have so many different personalities. You have so many different stories
Yeah.
behind those people.
Yeah, the thing is that people who are involved in individual sports, they tend to be, really self-motivated and self-sufficient. And, so I've dealt with athletes who are involved in, for example, triathlon or longer duration sports, individual sports. And, they are so motivated by the finer details and fixated on numbers and targets and so on. Team sports is a little bit different because team sport, everyone is together and they're all aiming towards the same goal. And okay, metrics are important and things like body fat get measured and things like their grams of carbohydrate get measured, but it's not done in the same way that it's done in endurance sports, and it's probably not the same limitation on performance as it might be in an endurance sport. So you get very, very different personalities and approaches between, say, individual endurance sports versus team field-based invasion sports. And so it's, again, that's an interesting perspective as well. Not all athletes are the same either in terms of their motivations, their behaviors, and their knowledge either.
Good to know. Good to know that that everyone. Yeah, I think that's something which I really appreciate you covering today. Is this idea that there's not one approach to the destination, right? We can take different routes and understand what works for us. But I think these basics are really important of continuity and not just kind of falling for the fads and the various things and then getting demotivated. So I really appreciate you, painting a really well-balanced picture for people listening and for me as well. So thanks, Brendan, for taking the time and sharing your expertise and your knowledge with me today.
My pleasure. It was very enjoyable. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Take care.